lot of individuals who found their way to psychedelics, especially before they became cool, these were people who were let down by the conventional model.
Erica, I'd like to hear a lot more about why.
When we look at how psilocybin works, it acts on the serotonin receptor.
Can you explain a little bit what SSRIs are, how they work, what they treat?
Psilocybin is what makes a mushroom a magic mushroom. It's the substance in a mushroom that makes it a psychedelic mushroom. The process looks different for each individual person, whether or not they're on a psychiatric medication.
Going forward, for me, thanks to this conversation, I'm going to view things differently and talk about them differently too. Welcome back to the Webdelics podcast. We have with us today Dr. Erica Zelfand. And I have to say, if there is an episode that you're going to watch on YouTube, this is the one to do it, because I have to say, Dr. Zelfand, there is an incredible mountain that you are sitting in front of right now. It is utterly epic. It's well worth looking at YouTube for. It's somewhere in Mexico, I hear. Is that correct?
Yep. I'm living my best life in Mexico. We're also doing some of the work we're going to be talking about and kind of soaking up the sweet energy of the mountains.
I can feel the energy coming right through the screen even as we're talking. So anyway, if nothing else, thank you for bringing that energy into the show today. And we are so very excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Today, we are going to talk about the interrelationship of psychiatric drugs and psychedelics as a mental health treatment modality. Now, on this podcast, as well as elsewhere in the general discussion sphere around psychedelics as a mental health treatment modality, there has been a lot of discussion about psychedelics having an increased public acceptance to deal with a lot of trauma-related and other issues that people are facing regarding their mental health because of the ineffectiveness of traditional psychiatric medicines due to the fact that they may be being overprescribed, or a whole host of other reasons. There are those who take the position that the days of prescribing psychiatric medicines of the traditional sort may be over, and that psychedelics could potentially completely replace them. Others simply say that they are modalities that are artificial, that are not natural, that have a whole host of problems associated with them, not the least of which is inefficacy or overprescription for profit motives, and that psychedelics can be a very powerful alternative to that. But one thing we haven't talked about so far, and that you don't hear a lot about generally, is using traditional psychiatric medications and psychedelics together. When might that be appropriate? Is that something that we can begin to think about as a society at all? How would that impact patient outcomes? What would it look like from a treatment perspective? And will there be a stigma that's associated with those that may choose to pursue their own mental health through traditional psychiatric means as opposed to psychedelics? Is such a stigma, if it develops, reasonable or fair at all? That's something you feel a lot of passion about. Erica, I'd like to hear a lot more about why.
Oh my gosh, there are so many points in your intro where I just wanted to jump in and start the conversation. So I'm happy to get rolling. At one point, I also wanted to sing that song, "So Happy Together," because there is this really arbitrary and, in my opinion, juvenile and unnecessary disparagement of healing systems, where the conventional model sort of pushes its glasses up on its nose and says, well, I believe in evidence-based medicine and we don't have enough clinical trials on these psychedelic, blah, blah, blah. And then on the other side, you've got the people in the psychedelic world being like, oh, well, pharmaceuticals are just for numbing you out and they're a crutch and they don't actually help you deal with your problems. And I take issue with both of those. And so the problem with being in the middle is that people give me a hard time from both sides. it's not just coming at me from one side or another. It's like I get haters from all the sides. But also what I get is a lot of clients who are kind of like in the middle. They're like the children in the middle of a bad divorce, where they're like, am I really such a bad person if I do this or if I do that? What if I want to do both? And there's a lot of misinformation out there. Part of that does have to do with stigma and bias. Part of that has to do with, admittedly, we need more data. We need more clinical research. We don't have a lot of data. And a lot of what I'm actually going to share, and that informs my opinion, is based on a little bit of data and then some extrapolation based on that data that may or may not be, I'm just going to say it's probably an imperfect science. But also what I've seen with my own patients and my own clients in doing this work. So I'm just going to start by saying it absolutely depends on which psychiatric drug we're talking about and which psychedelic we're talking about. But as a whole, to say that you cannot combine psychiatric drugs with psychedelics as a blanket statement, that is patently false. It is likewise false to say all psychiatric meds are safe to combine with all psychedelics. That's a very dangerous false statement as well. But in between those two polarities, there's a lot of gray, and there is actually a lot of beauty and a lot of nuance and healing in that gray. And that's where I operate mostly. I work largely with people who are on psychiatric medications and who say they're helping somewhat, but I need something more. Or they're not helping at all, but I can't get off them because I'm chemically hooked and I need something more. And likewise, I work with people from the psychedelic world who come to me and say, don't tell anybody that I'm talking to you. I've been doing psychedelics for 5 years, 10 years. I still have depression, and I think it's time to talk about going on a medication. And all of those people can be helped.
I so appreciate your candor there. And I have to say, with regards to that latter group of people, I can relate to it, not personally, but simply as someone who is involved with an organization like Webdelics, particularly as a podcast host. When people find out the work that I do here, and I begin to share with them some of my own experiences with psychedelics, or maybe some of the experiences that guests who talk about how psychedelics helped resolve their own mental health issues, you find people who say that exact same thing. There's so much hype going on with regards to psychedelics' power for mental health problems that people who have tried them maybe multiple times feel a little bit embarrassed, like they are psychedelic failures. I love the fact that you are taking a middle ground in an era in time and in general with regards to discourse in which there is a tendency for everyone to move into polarities, and people that walk the space in between can feel inferior or off or squishy or easily subject to ridicule. And the psychedelic space is, of course, no exception to that general approach to social discourse that we have across disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think part of that is because a lot of individuals who found their way to psychedelics, especially before they became cool or before we saw these legalization efforts, these were people who were let down by the conventional model. These were people who maybe tried several medications and weren't helped by them, or tried conventional talk therapy. And sometimes these interventions do more harm than good if we keep insisting, like, no, this is the only path. And so with that wounding can come a polarization. But unfortunately, a lot of those polarized individuals are the trendsetters in the field, and speaking from their wounding, maybe doing others harm.
Do you feel as though enough data is out there now? And I understand that, as you just stated a few minutes ago, the data around the efficacy of psychedelic medicines for mental health treatment is still emerging. But do you feel enough data is out there at this point to begin to confidently suggest that people who might not have been able to find success with their issues through traditional medicine should begin to look into those? And where do they even begin to start? Like, how do they even know, okay, this might be something that's working for me, or that isn't working for me now, but might work for me in the future?
Right. No, it's a good question. The short answer is we've got data on psychiatric meds and we've got data on psychedelics. We don't have a lot of data on the two together, hand in hand. We do have some. We do have some studies. Um, I'm not even going to say they are all focused on SSRIs because it's not just SSRIs, it's one drug. Is most of the studies are on S-citalopram, which is one SSRI medication. Now, can we extrapolate data from S-citalopram studies onto fluoxetine, citalopram, and all the other drugs in that drug class? Maybe, maybe not. That's why we need more data. But what we have in addition to some trials is we have years, maybe even decades of experience of people who worked in the underground and took some risks. I'm actually going to do a shout out here to Eric Osborne, who was serving psilocybin mushrooms to people on SSRIs way before anyone was saying that that's probably okay to be doing and having great results. And then we also have a growing understanding of how these substances work, what receptors they act on, what the effect is on our neurotransmitter levels. Based on that, we can do some deductive reasoning. So no, I want to make it clear. I'm not here saying we have tons and tons of data saying it's safe. We don't, frankly. What we do have is a nuance and understanding. We have a little bit of clinical data, and we have years of anecdotal underground evidence. Based on that, in my own practice, both as a healthcare provider with a license and as a psilocybin facilitator with a license to do that, I feel very comfortable serving psilocybin mushrooms to people who are on an SSRI or SNRI medication, so on a medication that affects serotonin levels. And part of that is because when we look at how psilocybin works, or how we think it works in the body, is yes, it acts on the serotonin receptor, but it does not actually increase serotonin levels in the synapses between our nervous system cells. And so a lot of healthcare providers, well-meaning but misinformed, will tell their patients, no, you can't take mushrooms if you are on, let's say, Prozac, which is fluoxetine, because you could get something called serotonin syndrome. Serotonin syndrome is a very real and very dangerous condition where you get too much of a good thing. You actually get toxicity from having too much serotonin in the system. It can be lethal. It's a very serious condition, and I've seen it and I've treated it. But that warning doesn't take into consideration that psilocybin doesn't actually raise intrasynaptic serotonin levels. So in my years, I'm not going to say how many years, but in my years of working with both psilocybin and SSRIs, I've never had a single case of serotonin syndrome. And I go pretty high on my dosing. I think the most I've ever given somebody was 26 grams of mushrooms. So, you know, we go pretty high sometimes with the dosing, and I've never, you know, thank God, I've never seen a case of serotonin syndrome emerge from that combination, nor have I heard of one.
Just so we here on the show today are reaching everyone who might be listening or watching, irrespective of their degree of technical knowledge, can you explain a little bit what SSRIs are, how they work, what they treat, and then maybe if you could also explain a little bit more about what psilocybin in particular is. Those who watch the show or listen to it regularly know that those are a type of mushroom, the most common psychoactive mushroom, but maybe talk a little bit about how they work. So some of the scientific language that you used earlier could make a little bit more sense and have more context for folks.
Thank you. Thanks for calling me out on the jargon. I talk medicalese all day long, so
and we appreciate that.
We can break it down. Yeah. So first, I'll start with the pharmaceuticals. SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. Now, many of our antidepressant medications fall into this drug class. Not all of them, but many of them. So, for example, Prozac, which is also called fluoxetine, Lexapro, et cetera, et cetera. These drugs work in the nervous system by essentially making serotonin hang around for longer so that it can do more of its magical mood support juju. And so when individuals take these drugs, they do experience a boost in their serotonin and in the serotonin activity in the brain. And that's why when these drugs are combined with other drugs that increase serotonin levels, or even supplements. So, for example, some people take the supplement 5-HTP, which is a serotonin precursor. That can be a dangerous combination. So let's say you're taking like a Lexapro and then you take some 5-HTP. You're actually putting yourself at risk because you may be raising your serotonin levels so high that you poison yourself with serotonin. And that's called serotonin syndrome. And that is a medical emergency situation. Can I go to psychedelics now, or is there more on
Absolutely.
that
Nope.
that I should say?
Yeah,
Okay.
and please, if that makes it that
Okay.
part very clear, yeah, let us know a little bit more about psilocybin now.
Okay. Psilocybin is the active constituent in over 200 different species of mushrooms and truffles that grow on every single continent on this beautiful planet except for Antarctica. And psilocybin is what makes a mushroom a magic mushroom. It's the substance in a mushroom that makes it a psychedelic mushroom. And after we consume psilocybin containing mushrooms, our bodies convert the psilocybin to something called psilocin, and psilocin is what makes us trip. And part of how this beautiful drug works on the brain and spirit, if you believe in that, which I do, is it binds to the serotonin receptor in the central nervous system, a specific kind of serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A, not the most catchy or memorable name, but it binds to that serotonin receptor. And so for that reason, for many years, people have been very wary of combining psilocybin-containing mushrooms with SSRI medications because they say, oh, well, if psilocybin binds to serotonin receptors, then we've got a risk of serotonin syndrome if someone on an SSRI medication takes mushrooms. Now, theoretically, that's a very beautiful caution. We're, looking out for everybody. But in practice, that doesn't appear to be the case. Now, things get more complicated when you've got people on multiple psychiatric medications. The more meds you throw on board, the riskier things are. But I've never heard of a case of somebody who was on one SSRI medication who then took mushrooms and got in trouble. So far as I know, it hasn't happened. Mechanistically, it doesn't make sense that it would happen.
If there is someone that I know who has been then on antidepressants for some time, and either they've just stopped working or they never really worked that well in the first place, and they are interested in exploring psilocybin treatment as an add-on, what might they expect the difference to look like? And would it be just after one psilocybin experience, or might it be something that they have to do on a regular basis? Would they microdose? Like, how would the whole process look for them?
Well, the process looks different for each individual person, whether or not they're on a psychiatric medication. But some trends that we see, or that I've seen, is that when individuals are taking psychiatric medications, such as SSRI medications, their brains adapt to be on that medication. So even if somebody says, I've been taking escitalopram for 10 years, I don't feel like it's doing anything. If they stopped taking the escitalopram cold turkey, they would be in a world of pain because they would go through withdrawal. Because whether or not it's helping with their mood, their brain has adapted to have that drug on board. And so what I see happening, I'm going to take a little detour and then come to your question. So
Right.
what I see happening a lot in the psychedelic space is facilitators who, with the best of intentions, and perhaps a little bit of bias against psychiatric drugs, they tell people, if you want me to serve you psilocybin mushrooms, if you want me to serve you LSD, if you want me to serve you, X, Y, or Z peyote, you have to stop your psychiatric medication. And that puts people in a really tough spot because, as it turns out, it's really hard to stop a psychiatric medication,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's
Mm-hmm.
not helping you. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what I see happening a lot, I consult with people online, people around the world, is that people, they decide, okay, I want to heal with psychedelics, but first I have to stop this medication. And then when they go and try and stop their medication, they enter a world of hell. Usually what I see happening is they're trying to get off the medication way too fast. And going off of a medication is very destabilizing. It destabilizes chemistry, literally. Like your neurochemistry is a big soupy mess when you're going off of a medication. That is really going to knock someone off their center. And then if they're in that state and they take a psychedelic is also something that is destabilizing. Now, that's part of the
Mm-hmm.
beauty of psychedelics, right? Is they destabilize you from your comfortable misery or your business as usual that isn't working. But
Yeah.
when you layer a chemical destabilization on top of a psychospiritual destabilization that happens with a psychedelic, that's where people can really enter a crisis zone. And I have cleaned up a lot of those messes in my practice. And they take months, sometimes over a year, to restabilize somebody when that happens. So I'm a
Whoa.
bigger fan. Yeah, yeah. And, I do get somewhat of a negativity bias here because someone who goes off their meds and then takes LSD and has a great experience, they're not going to seek me out and make an appointment to tell me about it, right? So I
Yeah.
talk to the people who didn't fare so well. So that's what
Mm-hmm.
I know.
Mm-hmm.
So what I then recommend instead for most people, let's say like the average Joe who's like, I'm on this drug, I don't think it's working, I want to heal with psychedelics, is I have an appointment with that person and we talk about what their goals are, and what psychedelics would be more or less safe with the medication they're on. And then I say, stay on your medication, have your psychedelic healing experience. And having had that healing experience, it might make it a lot easier for you to weather the bumpy road of going off your psychiatric medication on the
Mm-hmm.
back end of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And to answer your question, Scott, I know it took me a long time to get here to answering your question, but
Worthwhile though.
it's real. It's really up to the person on, does that entail microdosing a psychedelic? Does that entail doing a big heroic dose? Does it entail doing something in the middle? How many trips do they take over how many months? And this is where we really need to be careful not to let psychedelics fall into the same problems that psychiatry has. We don't need to be so prescriptive, and we don't need to just shove people into algorithms with what their healing process can look like. So sometimes it's a one and done, sometimes it's, one journey and you healed your deepest wound and now you just got to weather the storm of chemical destabilization. Or sometimes it's going slow, healing in layers, chipping away at things and letting it be months or even years, but in a really sustainable way. Everyone's nervous system is a little different. So that's the beauty of psychedelics, is we can really customize how we're doing this work.
One of the things that I'm enjoying about this conversation so far, Erica, is that you managed to weave together almost the poetic, the mystical, the spiritual, and the clinical. And we're going to get to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But in one area, you were quite clinical in your description. I want to maybe attempt to humanize what you're saying in a way to make it clear to the audience, maybe have it hit home, the implications of part of your message earlier, or to see if I'm even understanding what you said. When you talk about a facilitator saying, look, for you to engage in a psilocybin experience with me, you need to get off of the antidepressants that you're in. Someone who is coming to the facilitator due to their depression, let's say, who has been on that medication and it isn't working, I would imagine is only going to the facilitator to some extent, at least probably entirely, out of desperation. And in that desperation, knowing full well that at least here in the United States, as well as large swaths of the Western world and other countries too, knowing that these substances, the psychedelic substances, are illegal, the very people who may be in a state of such desperation that they're willing to speak to a facilitator underground who tells them that may be reluctant to share with their doctor what they're thinking about doing. And so what I'm imagining could happen here is someone without the medical supervision of their doctor or without the guidance of someone like you who has some expertise in bridging the gap between these two worlds, going off these medicines, the psychiatric medicines, of their own volition, in their own way, maybe based on something they read on the internet, or maybe just talking to some friends or something like that, that isn't really medical advice, ending up destabilized, but not even having had a chance conceivably to go into the psilocybin experience. Because I mean, worst case scenario, if you're on psychiatric antidepressant medicines, you may have suicidal ideations. You could end up killing yourself, right? I just really want to hit home. Is that the sort of implication of handling this, the combination of these modalities and the words that a facilitator might say to someone coming to them being taken with the full gravity that needs to be put out there with regard to them, because this is someone's life.
It is. It is. And by the time somebody seeks out this work, especially in places where it's not legal, they're fighting for their lives very often. Or maybe they don't have a plan to pursue suicide, but they want their souls back. So they're fighting for their lives, or they're fighting for their souls, right? And then to be told, like, no, actually, I know you've been living in hell, but you need to go through some more hell before I can help you. Often people feel like they don't have a choice. So, okay, let's do it. And this is a big problem that we see actually even in above ground medicine, in modalities that are legal, that maybe don't even have anything to do with psychedelics, where providers don't talk to each other enough. There's not enough coordination of care. So if you've got your psychiatrist over here and your, mushroom facilitator or shaman over here, and they don't talk to each other, and not only do they not talk to each other, but you have to keep it a secret from one that you're even engaging with the other. And they are both talking trash about one another's medicines. That puts you in a really tough spot. Where it's the blind leading the blind, it's bad advice from Reddit, it's trying to hack together your own care plan on something that is actually really important and can go wrong. I mean, that's in large part why I created the nonprofit organization Right to Heal, where we do online conversations with people who are in the middle and just want to talk to someone who's not going to bully or shame them and knows about both worlds. So hopefully we can be a bridge for those people to help them make the smartest, safest choice that helps them enjoy their life without compromising it.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, folks are fighting for their souls. You're using language that is, of course, heavily associated with the mysticism that perhaps not universally, but consistently is connected with those that engage with psilocybin and other psychedelics and have these journeys or these trips. You are a doctor. When people are prescribing, in my experience, again, I'm not going to universalize here because especially with regards to what I'm about to say, it's not universal. But generally, when there are discussions about medical treatments through drugs like SSRIs and psychiatric conditions generally, including depression, as well as a whole host of others, the concept of the mystical or the soul is not generally at the forefront. It's more, okay, these are brain conditions that are there. They're medical. They can be fixed through medical means. How, Erica, did you come to merge the two? How do you merge the two as a doctor?
Well, first, Scott, I want to say that I hear and appreciate your praise, and I think it's rather pathetic that it needs to be praise. How did I, as a highly educated person, come to remember that people have souls? It's like, and yet, and yet, it's warranted when we see how healthcare is often delivered in our culture of, ICD-10 codes and CPT codes. And if you don't know what either of those things are, that's great. 7-minute visits, doctors having to meet quotas. I want to say, if you struggle with the American healthcare system, don't hate your doctor, because your doctor hates the system just as much as you do, right? We're both struggling on the same front. And a big part of medical training is our souls kind of get beaten out of us in the training. And then a lot of life post-medical school is like reconnecting with your soul or not. For me, it was reconnecting with my soul. And as it turned out, psychedelics were very helpful in my process for doing that, as well as sleep and travel and meaningful human interactions and movement and good food. But, when I went into medicine, I didn't want to become a mechanic of human bodies, right? I didn't go to study car mechanics. Humans have something that cars don't. And it's really the soul. That's what we have. That's what we have that machines don't. Or maybe machines have souls. I don't know. I haven't. Maybe the next mushroom trip I'll get to meet the car soul. But we have something that inanimate objects don't have. And so why go into medicine when you could just go into car mechanics, and then you don't get emergency phone calls at 3 a.m. and you don't get sued as much, right? For me, it's because I respect the spirit. And if the spirit isn't healthy, the body's not going to be healthy and the mind is not going to be healthy. It's just not going to work. And I would say the vast majority of psychiatric medications are really not addressing the level of the spirit, and that's why they can only go so deep. Now, I think that when used in a particular way, psychiatric medications can be combined with other modalities that help us access the spirit, but by design on their own, that's not really what they're meant to be doing. And that may be why we see so many people becoming what we call treatment resistant in medicine. And I hate the term treatment resistant, because what it implies is you're just broken, we can't win, and you're not fixable, right? But what it really means is we're not good enough at fixing what you've got, right? And the term treatment resistant makes it sound like there's something wrong with the patient, but actually what it means is there's something wrong with the healing system. There's something wrong with the doctor or with the medical system that the doctor is using. And so much of the beauty of psychedelics that we've seen, yes, from clinical trials, is that the so-called treatment-resistant people get better with psychedelic healing. And so psychedelics work in a completely different way, and that's why we need them. We need them integrated into the healing system.
That's the perfect place to perhaps begin to explore the opposite scenario that we touched on a little bit earlier. Someone who might have some distrust of the medical system. Hey, I have a lot of people in my own friendship circles who will not see doctors about anything. And if a doctor is going to prescribe a medicine, unless it is a pain reliever for a broken arm or something like that, they don't want to hear about it at all. And a lot of those folks might be the ones who, if they're facing, let's say, depression, end up going to a psychedelic facilitator as a frontline treatment. And then after a while, they may begin to realize that that's not working. How do we reach and speak to folks who might have that resistance with regards to SSRIs or other more traditional Western medication-based treatments for for their depression? And do you feel that the reverse is kind of true? They're only dealing with the soul, perhaps, but not dealing with any related underlying medical conditions that the traditional medicines might actually treat?
Mm. I think I think perhaps without meaning to, you're actually touching on a limitation of both healing systems, which is
Mm.
sometimes we don't look deep enough into symptoms. So let's say, let's say someone named Sky goes to see the doctor, and Sky says, I have depression. I've been depressed for a really long time. And the doctor says, oh my gosh, that's horrible. You shouldn't have to suffer so much. Here's a prescription for fluoxetine for Prozac.
Mhm.
You shouldn't have to suffer so much. Or a different scenario, Sky goes to a psilocybin facilitator and says, I've had depression for so long, I can't live like this anymore. And the facilitator says, oh, you poor thing, you shouldn't have to suffer so much. Let's heal your soul. Here are some mushrooms, right? But as it turns out, Sky has hypothyroidism and vitamin B12 deficiency and anemia, right? All of those conditions can cause depression.
Yeah.
And whether you're using a psychiatric drug or a psychedelic drug, you are not properly treating that depression. You are applying a Band-Aid with the tool that you think is the best tool, right? And so this is where psychedelic practitioners can become just as nearsighted as psychiatric practitioners. Is you gotta, going back to the car mechanics analogy, you gotta look under the hood, right? You gotta look under the hood and figure out, is the tool that I have actually the tool that this person needs right now? And as it turns out, psychiatric drugs are not the right tool for every situation, and psychedelic drugs are not the right tool for every situation, or every person, or every stage of life. So it becomes a level of assessing what that person's body, mind, and spirit are calling for. And you do really need to assess all three if you want to actually help someone in the most meaningful way. Not just have them spinning their wheels in the mud, thinking that they're treatment resistant when they just need some thyroid hormone.
Right. Fascinating stuff. And it is actually leading to another issue that is in the layer underneath everything that you just said, which is, let's say tomorrow, all of a sudden, the traditional Western medical establishment is totally comfortable across the board with psilocybin and other psychedelics as complementary treatments to the more medicinal and drug-based modalities that have been in use. And so facilitators are out there talking to their doctors comfortably, or talking to their clients' doctors comfortably all the time, and all of the harmful things that we talked about earlier that could happen when communication isn't occurring, that just goes away. Nonetheless, right now, the infrastructure for a regulatory support to ensure a minimal degree of harm coming to people who would go to the facilitators in this sort of circumstance just isn't there. Are you, without saying it, suggesting that in order for psychedelics and traditional antidepressant medicines to work together, we would need to have a medical or some sort of infrastructure in place in order to make sure that they can complementarily work together, so that we don't have a new facilitator who just maybe has gone on a mushroom journey or two and says, now I'm a shaman, which we both know happens, unfortunately. Right.
Yeah,
To keep that sort of thing
more than once in a while. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Frighteningly so. And so that's where this question is coming from. Or am I reading too much underneath what you're saying? Because I've been known to do that.
No, well, I think you're connecting some very important dots here, which is that ultimately healing works best when it's integrated, right? Meaning the person integrates their own experience, but also the healing modality is integrated into, what we call the care team of, you've got Sky, who I just, hypothetical patient here, who has a psychiatrist and a psilocybin facilitator. Those are the care team. Whether they want to acknowledge one another or not, they are all part of Sky's care team. And Sky's care is going to get better if the care team is communicative and connected. right? And that's when they can compare notes and be like, wait a minute, maybe Sky needs to see an endocrinologist, right? Because how is Sky going to know this just through, Reddit threads on microdosing? They're not. So yes, I mean, barriers break when people talk, especially when practitioners talk, because we've got the lingo and we've got the know-how that the patients don't have unless they went to medical school or respective professional trainings. And so I'm just thinking, I recently had a client who has a kind of a mystery disease that has stumped a lot of doctors. And so what we did was we all got on a Zoom call together and we just talked about him. Like, I'm thinking X, Y, or Z. What are you thinking over here? Because if we tell him, oh, be sure to tell your neurologist that I think, blah, well, we all played the game of telephone when we were kids, and we know what happens when you do that, right?
Right.
And so something that has changed that I'm very happy about in the state of Oregon, where I hold a license both as a primary care provider and as a psilocybin facilitator, is the law used to say that when I'm a psilocybin facilitator, I have to pretend like I'm not also a doctor. I can't wear both hats at the same time. And they recently changed that, or we're in the process of implementing that change, where now I'm allowed to be Dr. Zelfand and like your buddy Erica with the mushrooms. I'm allowed to be both people at once for my clients or patients. That's even the difference, Sometimes I call them patients. When they're facilitation clients, they're clients. But now I actually get to use all of my brain to help somebody, and guess what? I'm gonna be more effective in helping them, and they're gonna get better faster. So a more integrated model it includes within the patient and what's around them as well.
Do you see, and this might be time for a truth bomb, Erica, a future in which there is an entire subspecialty of doctors who are also facilitators? When you are in a dangerous crossroads with regards to your mental health, let's say the SSRIs that you've been on just aren't working anymore. Maybe it's time to leave the psychiatrist that you've been working with and look for someone who has both a medical degree and a psychedelic facilitation certification. And that's just something that is out there in the way that it is in the future.
I think it's already happening. I know I have several colleagues that are healthcare providers that have become licensed psychedelic facilitators. Some of them have also gone underground. I think it's already happening, but I'm not sure that it has to happen if we're able to get a more integrated model, right? So if your primary care doctor is talking to your psychiatrist and they're talking to your shaman or your facilitator, you might not need one person who does all three if you've got all three, but they actually communicate and respect each other, right? Now, I think that's going to take a long time to happen. I think it's going to take a very long time to happen. And I think in the meantime, what is holding back licensed healthcare providers from becoming facilitators is they don't want to jeopardize their medical licenses.
Yeah.
Some boards are more or less amenable to this idea of doing what's considered a new and experimental therapy, even though it's like been around since 5000 BCE and it's by no means new. We still consider it new and experimental. Some people have that appetite for that risk and some people really don't. And, healthcare providers in the United States were always worried about being sued. And so, there's a lot of things that are holding us back from helping more people. But ultimately, you can be a really good doctor and become a psychedelic facilitator and still be missing the point completely. Because as long as we have this reductionistic way of thinking about things where we forget the soul, then psychedelics are just a really fancy psychiatric drug. And we're going to use them just as reductionistically and just as short-sightedly as we do psychiatric drugs. There has to be something deeper. We have to have a more nuanced respect for the healing force within every patient if we're going to use any of these tools properly. Otherwise, it's just another pill.
And do you see any movement in the larger medical community in that direction? Because you are right, to the extent that as many of our guests have said, these psychedelics are portals into the world of the soul, not just a different type of pill, unless and until that place to which the portal enters is acknowledged. The solutions that psychedelics can point to are always, to my eyes at least, always going to be out of reach completely.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone tells me they want to kind of step into this other realm if they're a healthcare provider, and they say, yeah, and I'd love to work with psychedelics. First thing I ask them is, have you taken a psychedelic? Now, I don't think that everyone has to have had a psychedelic experience to be a good facilitator. A lot of people disagree with me on that one. Kind of like I don't think you have to be a woman who has had a baby to be a good obstetrician, but it sure helps. It sure helps. And there's nothing quite like that lived experience of have you gone deep within yourself so that you can get really clear. First of all, so you can clear your own baggage so you don't dump that on your patients without realizing it, but also so you can get really clear on what it is you're doing when you give somebody a psychedelic drug. If you're treating this as just like, oh yeah, the Prozac doesn't work anymore, now let's try this pill, you might be missing a very important part of that story. Your patients will still probably get better, by the way. But it might take more treatment or more time or with more complications than if you got really, really clear on like, okay, I'm helping people get aligned in mind, body, and spirit. And to really understand what that means helps us wield these very powerful tools with a lot more skill and efficacy.
I can't help but wonder, too, if that understanding moving beyond the medical community itself and into the general public, in particular, the secular public that right now may be mostly hearing information about their medical health through a non-soul based discourse, will also be instrumental in having the possibilities that the wider use of psilocybin and other psychedelics within a mental health ecosystem that includes existing psychiatric drugs might help make that something that people can more readily ask for or be readily even aware of as a possibility, and what that could mean for everyone rather than putting the entire onus on the medical community itself, although of course the medical community should to some extent have that onus.
Yeah, well, what sells is what consumers demand. And if enough consumers start demanding this, there might be more of it available. And in the meantime, as I mentioned, healthcare providers they're kind of, a lot of them sense there's something here, but they're scared. They don't want to get in trouble. But if enough patients knock on enough doors of enough HMO administrators' offices and say, we want this, we demand this, I'm going to take my business elsewhere if I don't get that, we might see a shift. I anticipate that it's a matter of time before we do. And in the meantime, I think ketamine might be the first to be cracking, the crack in the dam, so to speak. I think we're starting to see that with ketamine. But again, ketamine's a psychedelic, but I don't think it's being used in a very spirit-friendly way by a lot of these healthcare systems. To put somebody alone in a dark, air-conditioned room hooked up to an IV without any therapy or any music or even just a blanket, that's a very different experience than having a very supported, nurturing time with ketamine in which there is integration and talk about one's soul, right? And guess which one has better outcomes? The latter, the second one.
Yeah, and let's face it, too, when it comes to ketamine, some of the most visible people who have used that for their mental health challenges aren't exactly models of soulful behavior. I don't know that I need to say much more than that.
No, I mean not the ones that make the headlines, but also you got to consider what typically makes something newsworthy, what makes a headline, media has changed a lot because money drives more of it. The internet plays a big role. Is you're not going to read an article that has a headline that reaffirms something you already thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
What sells papers, what gets clicks, what gets subscribers is when there's a splash and when there's drama, right? We love drama, especially when it's in other people's lives. And when it's like, hey, you thought this, actually you were wrong, it's this. It's like, what? Okay, I'm going to click on that. And
Right.
so, you know, a lot of the PR around psychedelics in general, but especially ketamine, is sort of unsavory in that way. I will say I'm a ketamine prescriber, and I think it's a beautiful drug when used properly, when you know what you're doing, when you know what the goal is. And when you see a person as a whole integrated being, it doesn't really matter what substance you give them. It doesn't matter if I had to write a prescription and they had to, you know, go to Target pharmacy to get it, or if it grew out of the ground and they went and took it, you know, with a shaman in the mountains of Mexico. Because when you're considering the whole person, it's like the goal is just to support that person, not to prove yourself right that a certain drug is better or worse.
When you talk about supporting the whole person, it points as to the one real takeaway that I'm going to remember this very rich conversation for a very long time, Erica. And that is the whole person, not just being the body and the mind, but unapologetically, when it comes to mental health, the soul. I can't tell you how many times when I have had conversations about mental health, and by the way, I've worked for 3 social service agencies in my career. We generally did not talk about the soul when we were talking about the challenges of the clients within those organizations' ambit. Going forward, for me, thanks to this conversation, I'm going to view things differently and talk about them differently too. And that's the powerful call to action that you've left me with, Erica. If there is something that you would like to have everyone remember this conversation by, or something that you wanted to say but didn't have a chance to yet, what might that be?
Two things. One, I just want to make a note on safety. So not all psychiatric drugs are the same. Not all psychedelics are the same. There are some psychedelics, in particular ayahuasca and ibogaine, that absolutely do not play well with psychiatric medications. Please, I want to make it very clear, in no way am I saying that you can be on an SSRI and take ayahuasca. That's a very bad idea. Please don't do that.
Thank you.
So that's sort of the PSA bit. And the other bit, I want to harp on what you just said, Scott, is to remember that you have a soul. And so, dear listener, if you've been doing things to help yourself and you've been focusing on the body, okay, maybe you're doing intermittent fasting, or maybe you're doing ice plunges, or eating keto, or eating vegan, or exercise, whatever you're doing, okay, that's great that you're working on the body. Remember, you have a mind. Remember, you have a soul. So if you're only working on your mind, okay, doing crossword puzzles, doing talk therapy, doing, what else do people do for their minds? Not doom scrolling on social media, not looking at don't look at glowing screens after, 10 p.m. or so. That's great. Remember, you also have a body. Remember, you also have a soul. Now, if you're doing soul work, if you're following around a guru, if you're praying, if you're meditating, if you're setting intentions, that's beautiful. Remember, you also have a mind, you also have a body. And you need all three. They are a milking stool, because in your time on this earth, your spirit has been injected into this sacred vessel, and this sacred vessel contains a mind and a body. So what does your dear, beautiful soul want to do with this amazing vessel that it's got? It's got a body and it's got a mind. What does your soul want to do with those things? Right? And your body and your mind need your soul, because the minute your soul leaves, guess what? Your body and your mind die, and you get buried or cremated or whatever happens there. So understanding that you've got all three, and to check in with all three from time to time and make sure that you're taking good care of all three.
At the top of the hour, we talked about the beautiful backdrop that you're sitting in front of. But what I also got to see in this conversation was the beauty of your soul, Erica. And I thank you for sharing that. I know that anyone who has listened to or watched this episode will be similarly touched, and they're going to want to know more about you. Where can they find that information out?
Well, thank you. I hope that I can meet and support as many of you and witness your growth and your healing and your learning. I'm going to mention a few different websites. The first is me, drzelfand.com, D-R-Z, like zebra, E-L-F as in Frank, A-N-D.com. Now, my last name's a doozer, so if you don't want to deal with writing it down or remembering it, you can also go to writetoheal.com because it is right and correct to heal. Or you can go to riseupjourneys.com, and that is the retreat company that I founded. So we'll find each other some way online and hopefully in real life. We will connect.
And if Webdelics has been the connector that makes that happen for those that are in need, we will have been proud to have played that role.
Yeah, the web will have done its webbing. So thank you for connecting us all.
Exactly. For those of you who enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to this channel on your favorite audio platform or on YouTube. Leave a 5-star review on your favorite audio platform or a comment beneath the YouTube video if that's what you're watching. And then be sure to share this video with anyone that you know who may benefit from it. Once you've done all of that, also follow us on our social media platforms, then go to our website at webdelics.com. That's webdelics.com. Sign up for our newsletter. There are some fascinating articles about psychedelics and sacred medicines there. And then above all else, be sure to come back again for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.